Greetings and salutations, friends and gamers of all stripes. My name is GM Dave. I am your man behind the screen. And thank you for joining me on this Thursday morning, even though it won't be uploaded on Thursday morning, for another rambling, roaming vlog. So, today's episode, I want to move into a topic that's a little more specific. Specifically more system specific. Too many specifics. We're going to talk specifically, again, too many specifics, about 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And what are we talking about with 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons? Excuse me. We're going to discuss the Paladin question. Oh yes, we're throwing our hat into that ring, for better or for worse. And we're going to talk about that still ongoing debate. Should paladins be required to be lawful good? Now, a little bit of history and context for the uninitiated. For those few of you out there for whom 5th edition is your first iteration of D&D, you haven't looked into the other iterations, you haven't looked into Pathfinder, so you may not be entirely aware of the history of the Paladin class. So from the very start, the first iteration of D&D, the Paladin class was a warrior of honor, chivalry, and virtue. They were goodly protectors of the innocent and staunch defenders against evil in all forms. But the original iteration of D&D did not have alignments. The game was designed specifically for you to play as heroes fighting against villains. You were meant to be good fighting against evil. So, alignments as we understand them today didn't really exist in 1st edition D&D. It wasn't until later on that the alignment system that we know now came into being. And when it came into being, the people at TSR and then later on Wizards of the Coast, they wanted to preserve that identity of the Paladin as a defender of good, a warrior against evil, and a knight of nobility, of honor, of chivalry, and of virtue. So they gave them a very strict alignment requirement, much stricter than any other class. To play a paladin, you must be lawful good. That was the case over the entire span of Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder's lifetime until the release of 5th edition. Now, I don't really know for sure why 5th edition decided to make this change. I haven't looked into that aspect of it. To me, it honestly doesn't really matter exactly why they made the change. The point is that they made the change. But if I had to guess, I would say it would be due to the many, many years of pushback from the community about the fact that paladins were so heavily restricted in their alignment. And that pushback, I think, comes largely from the fact that that heavy restriction, while it actually leaves a lot of interesting roleplay and mechanics challenges open to the players and GMs, is something that is very difficult for less experienced players and GMs to handle effectively. Paladin, in a lot of ways, was is actually the most divisive class in all of Dungeons & Dragons history because of that one restriction. And I think that's because a lot of people don't really know how to properly play within that restriction. They look at that and then they start getting this idea in their head that they have to kind of be this stuffy, stuck-up, fun-killing party ruiner, you know, committing all the party fouls, basically saying, you can't do this, I won't let you do this, I'm a paladin, I'm a I'm a being of virtue and good. You can't act evil or naughty in my presence at all, or I'm going to punish you. Real stick-up-the-ass type. A lot of paladins I see get played like this, and that is a huge mistake. But we're not here to discuss that. We're here to discuss whether paladins need to be lawful good. But in order to figure that out, we first need to define the paladin. Now, I have, in part, defined what a paladin used to be for D&D. A warrior of holiness, of chivalry and virtue and honor, sworn to defend the weak, sworn to protect love, sworn to embody goodness and order, and sworn to act as a bulwark against darkness and evil. The proverbial light in the darkness. But that's not the only definition for a paladin. And in fact, if you want to get into official definitions, that definition is nowhere for paladins. Now, officially, paladins are defined in a few ways. If you were to type paladin definition up into Google or Bing or whatever other search engine you like, the first couple of definitions you would come up with would be, first and foremost, the historical definition. That of being one of 12 specific members of Charlemagne's court. The second being a warrior of great chivalry, virtue, and honor. And I'm paraphrasing that. I don't actually remember the specific wording, but you get the idea. However, those are not the only definitions. If you scroll down, particularly on Google, the first link you're going to find is the Merriam-Webster definition. And I'm going to take these two as basically being the second and third highest definitions. These aren't the one that Google puts up at the top, but they're the first link, so they're the second and third highest definitions, as far as I'm concerned, for this video. So, discounting the historical definition, the second and third highest definitions are: a paladin is a great commander and a great leader. Mostly in the sense of a prince, the example Merriam-Webster gives is like a prince on the battlefield leading his army. You could also say, an aristocratic knight, a noble knight who is leading a force in the name of his king or kingdom, a duke, whatever. Some sort of leader leading his army into battle. That's paladin. The other definition they give, and again, paraphrasing, is, just a moment here. The other definition they give is someone who champions a champion of a particular cause or belief. Now, nowhere in any of those definitions does it say that a paladin is specifically a holy warrior. Nowhere in any of those definitions, except for the first one, does it say a paladin must specifically be goodly and virtuous and all that. And actually, even in the first one, it does not say a paladin is goodly and virtuous. It says a paladin holds strong to the code of chivalry, holds strong to the idea of valor, and holds strong to honor. Now, a lot of people don't realize chivalry, valor, and honor, although we view them as such today, historically are not inherently good things. Chivalry is, in a lot of ways, like Europe's code of Bushido that the samurais had during the feudal era. Bushido was a code of honor code of honor and more that the samurai would adhere to, that sort of dictated how they would behave. Chivalry is the same thing, but more or less, but for a knight. So a paladin is someone who adheres strongly to the idea of chivalry, who adheres to a code of valor and a code of honor. And that is still very much represented in both the older versions and the current version, the 5th edition version of the Paladin. Even though they are not restricted by alignment anymore, they are still restricted in that they must follow a code of conduct, they must follow a chivalric code as defined by whatever faith they're a part of, whatever god they're a part of. However, notice that definition is based on whatever faith or god they're a part of. Now, you can have a faithless paladin, potentially, much like you can have a faithless cleric in 5th edition and older editions. There actually used to be specifically a prestige class for that, the priest. The priest used to specifically be a prestige class for clerics who followed no god. You can have that with a paladin as well, but much more frequently, the paladin is, in essence, for all senses of argument, a holy warrior. There's no definition anywhere that I found that specifically says, no proper definition that doesn't involve gaming, that specifically says a paladin is a holy warrior. So, for the sake of Dungeons and Dragons, we need to redefine the paladin a little bit. A paladin is a warrior who adheres to a strict code of conduct. They adhere to a strict code of valor. And they are a holy warrior for whatever god or gods, potentially, depending on your setting, they choose to serve. Or that chooses them to serve. Now, in older editions, because of the alignment restriction, it would be more specifically said that a paladin is a holy warrior of virtue, of chivalry, and of honor, who defends the good, who protects the innocent, and who acts as a shield against the darkness and against evil. But since 5th edition has done away with that, we can't limit the paladin specifically to that. So the question then becomes, since we cannot strictly limit the paladin to this, we cannot just look at the paladin and say, you're a holy warrior of goodness. We can't say that anymore, because that's not the case. 5th edition has changed that. They are not a holy warrior who fights specifically for goodness and holiness. We must now ask, does 5th edition capture enough of the spirit of the paladin to let it be that even when they're not lawful good, you can still call a paladin a paladin? And I would argue that the answer is both yes and no. Now, I'm going to have to pause the video for a moment here. I'm actually pulling up to a stop I have to make for work, so we're going to pause for a moment, but don't fret. We'll be back very, very shortly. In fact, for all of you, it's going to be instantaneous. So, if you'll please just give me one moment, I will be right back. Okay, and we are back. I apologize for that very brief interruption, but let's go ahead and continue the paladin question. So, we've taken a look at what the paladin used to be in previous editions of D&D. We've taken a bit of a look at what the paladin has since been changed into in 5th edition. We have also looked at a few definitions that help to clarify a little bit of what a paladin is, and use those to create our own definition for both the old paladin and the new paladin. But before we continue, before we can effectively answer the paladin question, before I can explain to you why I say that my answer is both yes and no, we need to make our definition of the paladin more concrete. So, just as a reminder, we have defined the old paladin essentially as follows. The old Paladin in D&D was a holy warrior in service to their god who followed a code of conduct, who followed the tenets of their faith, and through those tenets would defend the weak, uphold justice, uphold justice, protect love, and stand against the forces of evil and darkness as a bastion against those forces in defense of those who cannot defend themselves. That is, in a lot of ways, very representative of the classic D&D Paladin. But what about the 5th edition Paladin? What has changed? Well, in order to understand that fully, we need to take a look at what comprises the core of the old Paladin. Because it may surprise some of you, but that core has actually not changed. It is still the same. So, at its core, and this will be our final definition of a paladin in Dungeons & Dragons. A paladin is a holy warrior who follows the tenets of their faith. Using those tenets, they either construct or have constructed for them a code of conduct that determines how they will act and what they will do in the service of their god as they champion their god's cause. So, where does the difference lie? Well, the difference lies in that the restrictions of the old paladin come from the fact that the tenets they are meant to follow, the tenets based on their faith, are intrinsic to the class's identity. 5th edition changes only one thing about the paladin. They change the fact that those tenets are now no longer intrinsic to the class identity. And because of that, you now have a lot more options as a player to develop those tenets on your own. A paladin is no longer specifically a holy warrior of justice and light and goodness. They are now simply a holy warrior, a skilled, pious, holy warrior. Now, to clarify something real briefly here, a lot of tabletop games take an approach to holiness that puts it on par with or defines it as, in a sense, as goodliness. I want to make clear here, for this definition, holiness and goodliness are not the same thing. Although that is a very common definition across tabletop role-playing games, we are taking a more real-world approach with the definition. And in our day-to-day lives, although we tend to view things that, for those of us who are of faith, I am not among them, but for those of us who are of faith, and those who used to be of faith, like myself, we view the things that we see as holy, like our gods, mythical creatures that we find to have a sense of divinity, so on and so forth, to be goodly. That's usually why we worship them. We view them as good. Even if it's a good that we fear, we view them as good. But holiness is not intrinsically good. If it were, well, then you wouldn't have disparate faiths saying that their individual gods are holy. You wouldn't have disparate faiths existing at all. You would have a single unified faith viewing the same god or gods as holy and worthy of worship. But you don't have that. You've got disparate faiths, just like you do in D&D. Every character in D&D, just like every person in real life, views whatever god or gods they worship, whatever faith they hold, or whatever sense of beliefs they hold, generally to be good. We generally tend not to hold the beliefs that we view as evil, unless, you know, we've got some sort of screw loose in the head. So, holiness does not equate to goodness here. Holiness equates to divinity. That is why you can have a lawful good paladin and a chaotic evil paladin, and both of them will still be considered a holy warrior. So, holy warriors in service to their gods, following a code of conduct defined by the tenets of their faith. That is the distillation of a paladin. And that distillation is what 5th edition has built the class around. So, the class identity itself has been thinned out a bit. It's been emptied a bit, made lesser, so that you as a player now, or you as a GM, can have more options to fill it yourself. And personally, I think that's a great thing. And that is a large reason why I say, on one hand, no, a paladin does not need to be lawful good to be a paladin. Because at its core, in Dungeons & Dragons, a paladin is a holy warrior of their faith, among the most pious champions of their cause. That is a paladin. However, there is an aspect of the older D&D games, the older editions, that also makes me say that, yes, a paladin is also defined specifically as that lawful good paragon of justice. And why do I take this sort of wishy-washy stance? Well, it's because of something that is lost or potentially lost, I should say, in the shift from the more stringent, rigid, and restricted old paladin to this newer, more open-ended, more options available, roleplay-wise, version of the paladin. And it is not the tradition. If, in my opinion, if your argument is that the paladin must be lawful good because that's how it was at the start, your argument is weak, and you need to go back to the drawing board and really consider whether or not you've taken a hard look at the class and whether or not the identity of the class is dependent on that limitation. Personally, I say it isn't. Because the identity of the class is essentially that of a holy warrior. It does not have to be a good holy warrior, it is simply a holy warrior. However, there is one set of arguments that I can look at and I can say, yes, this I can agree with. This is a good argument for why this change to the paladin wasn't necessary. And that is the existence of the blackguard. And for Pathfinder as well, the existence of the anti-paladin. Even though its scope is also more limited than the you can be any alignment scope of 5th edition, the blackguard represents the possibility for the evil paladin. It already existed in Dungeons & Dragons, and it represented a really cool and interesting roleplay dynamic because the blackguard, much like the paladin, filled a very specific roleplay niche with some very specific requirements to play it. Now, unlike the paladin, the blackguard is not a core class. It's a prestige class. You have to meet certain requirements to become a blackguard. One of those requirements is that you have to be a paladin who has fallen from grace. In order to be a blackguard, you must have been a goodly paladin who fell from grace, lost their tie to their god, and gave in to the temptations of evil. It's kind of like the Jedi and the Sith in that sense. That creates a very interesting and very fun roleplay dynamic, a very strong duality between these two classes. One is good, one is evil. Both came from the same core concept, the same core area. And they are hated enemies. Blackguards and Paladins, they don't get along. Ideologically, they are polar opposites, where the Paladin is the lawful good paragon of justice and virtue, who defends the weak, protects love, and stands as a bulwark against all that is evil. The Blackguard is a chaotic evil paragon of strife, torment, pain, and tyranny, who seeks to destroy all in their path and bring subjugation and rule by force to anything and everything they see. One is stringently good, the other is stringently evil. Unfortunately, the Blackguard has sort of lost its place in Dungeons & Dragons due to the changes made to 5th edition's Paladin. Why do I say this? I mean, you can still play a Blackguard. They still exist. I don't actually... I have to pick up the Dungeon Master's Guide again and check to see if they are still a prestige class in 5th edition. I think they were, but I'll need to pick it up and take a look again. I'll update the video in the comments, and I'll update in the description once I do. But even if they aren't, you can still play a Blackguard type character. You can still play a Paladin who falls from grace. The problem is, the Blackguard as the prestige class, the Blackguard in its classic role, has sort of lost the strength of its identity. Because, even though all of us know that you can still play a lawful good Paladin who falls from grace, goes chaotic evil, and becomes a Blackguard. You can absolutely still do that. The option is still on the table. The option is never left. However, if you want to play an evil Paladin, well, now you can just play an evil Paladin. You don't have to play a Blackguard to do that anymore. It's no longer a requirement. Personally, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but that does damage the identity of both the Paladin class and the Blackguard. Losing that strict requirement of the Paladin damages the identity of the Blackguard as well. And that is why I can see the argument that the Paladin should be lawful good, and only lawful good, holding water. Because you already had the opposite. You already had the duality. It already existed in the Blackguard. And it was a very interesting and engaging duality that still gave both classes a lot of room to play with. You had the options. And you could create some great roleplay moments by having a Paladin turn into a Blackguard. Some of the best roleplay stories I've seen have followed that arc. Some of the best fantasy stories I've seen have followed that arc. Hell, Warcraft 3 largely follows the arc of the Paladin Arthas Menethil falling from grace, becoming a Death Knight, essentially a Blackguard. It's there, and it's a strong and interesting story. A story that is now a little bit lost thanks to that 5th edition change. So in that sense, that is why I say both yes and no. I lean more towards the no myself. I personally think the extra options are good, but hey, that's just my take. What's your take? What do you think of the Paladin question? Do you think I provided a decent answer, a decent rebuttal to those people who say that the Paladin absolutely must be lawful good? I'd like to think I do, but maybe you don't, or maybe you do. Tell me in the comments below. If you liked the video, leave a like if you found it useful. And if you would like to see more, please consider subscribing and sharing my content. I would appreciate every little bit of help I can get. In the meantime, my name is, as usual, GM Dave. I am your man behind the screen, and I will see you again very soon. Roll high, role play well, and game on.